Hi, I'm Julio Alvarado Jr. Here I create teachings that help people learn how to hear and discern the voice of God through scripture, meditation, and spiritual attentiveness. One of the biggest questions people ask is this: how do I know if a thought is coming from God or is it just me? Because the mind is never silent. Thoughts are always happening, emotions are always present. And many sincere people want to follow God, but they were never taught how to discern what is actually happening within their own minds. If you've ever seen my teaching on relational discernment, that episode helps explain why discernment begins in relationship with God. But in this episode, we're going to focus on something different: how discernment actually works. What is discernment and how does it function within the human mind? And how do you begin recognizing which thoughts align with the mind of God's and which do not? Because discernment is not guesswork, it is trained spiritual capacity. And once you understand how it works, so much confusion begins to break. So let's get into it. In this teaching, we're going to explore one of the most important questions in the spiritual life. How do I recognize God's thoughts within my own thinking? Because the mind is never silent. And confusion begins when we try to follow God without discerning the source of thoughts that we hear within our minds. And discernment is not intuition, it's not emotion, and definitely it's not guesswork. Discernment is a function of the human spirit. And when it is trained, the mind becomes capable of recognizing what aligns with God and what does not. You were created to think with God. Discernment is learning to recognize which thoughts arise from His presence within you and which do not. Now, in Scripture, discernment is not guessing, it is the ability to distinguish, examine, and recognize difference. Discernment is the trained ability to recognize the source of a thought within your own mind. Scripture reveals that multiple streams of thought operate within us. Thoughts that are shaped by memory, fear, desire, and habit. Thoughts that are formed by culture, trauma, and certain types of conditioning. And then we have thoughts that arise from God's Spirit. Discernment is learning how to separate these. This does not happen automatically. It happens through trained awareness. In Scripture, discernment is not described with one single word, but as a process, a set of inner capacities working together. The ability to distinguish one thought from another, the ability to examine what arises within whenever you have new thoughts, the ability to hear with understanding, and the ability to judge what actually aligns with God's will for your life. Scripture also describes discernment as knowing, but not intellectual knowing, but instead relational knowing. The Hebrew word for one of the first words that speaks about discernment in Scripture is the word know or knowing. The Hebrew word is yada, knowledge that is gained through experience, intimacy, and instruction. This tells us something essential. Discernment is not intuition, it is trained spiritual perception. It is the learned ability to notice, examine, and test and recognize and respond with an ongoing relationship with God. Now, the language of the mind is thought, and discernment begins the moment you realize that not all thoughts speak with the same voice. Scripture reveals God as a God of truth, and truth is not merely something to study, it is something to be recognized, to be received, and to be lived from. Jesus said it this way: You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free, in John chapter 8, verse 32. In Scripture, this kind of knowing is relational. It is not learned through information alone, but through inner instruction. Discernment was never meant to be developed independently. It is learned in relationship with God, in a shared learning environment with Him within your own mind. This is why Jesus said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me." Discernment is not about gathering more knowledge, it's about learning how to recognize truth as it is revealed within your own thinking. This is where discernment actually begins. Now, discernment grows the same way relationships grow, through proximity, through familiarity, through time and attention. You recognize a loved one's voice not because you have memorized it, but because you've been with them long enough to know how they speak. God's voice works in the same way. Discernment is not intellectual, it is relational familiarity with the presence of God speaking within you. And familiarity requires stillness, the kind of attention that allows recognition to form. This is where many people struggle. They are taught what to believe, but not how to become attentive enough to recognize what is happening within their own minds. Yet scripture says, "Be still and know that I am God." Without stillness, discernment cannot develop. And stillness is best experienced through meditation. Meditation is not about emptying the mind, it is training awareness and attention. Meditation is the intentional practice of becoming conscious of your thoughts, not necessarily to judge them initially, but to observe them long enough to discern their origin. Meditation trains the mind to quiet competing thoughts, to notice where a thought is leading, and to recognize alignment or misalignment with God, and to remain attentive long enough to learn from God. This restores the mind to its original purpose, which is to experience God's mind within it as a living, teaching presence. Discernment is how we hear God within our thinking, learning to recognize what aligns with His will and what does not. And Scripture makes this very clear. Discernment is a mark of spiritual maturity. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 14, and Romans chapter 12, verse 2 show that maturity is not defined by belief or time and faith, but by a mind that has been trained to recognize what aligns with the will of God. This tells us that discernment is, first of all, it's learned. It involves perception, not intellect alone. It distinguishes what aligns with God and, again, what does not align with God. Many believers remain confused, not because they lack sincerity, but because their minds were never trained to recognize God's thoughts. Discernment does not come from more information, it comes from transformation. And this is why Romans chapter 12, verse 2 tells us to be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so that you may be able to discern the will of God. To renew something is to restore it to its original purpose. The human mind was created to experience the mind of God within it as a guiding, teaching presence. Meditation is how that renewal actually begins because it trains the attention that discernment requires. Scripture reveals that discernment involves recognizing four inner streams of thought. We'll explore these fully in the next episode, but here is the framework for them. First of all, one of them is your spirit, what I refer to as the inner learner, that part of you that was designed to perceive and to be taught by God. The second stream of thought is, of course, God's voice, the inner teacher. God's Spirit guiding and instructing your mind. The third stream is the stream of reasoning, your mind being trained. In other words, it's the thinking process that learns and decides. More on that in the next episode. And the fourth stream of thought is the flesh. In other words, the carnal mind, thinking that is shaped by fear, habit, and survival. Discernment is what allows you to recognize which stream is speaking and which one should be leading. And this is where clarity begins. So, again, we're going to explore this further in the next episode. But if this teaching helped bring language and clarity to something you've been trying to understand internally, share in the comments what stood out to you the most. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to this channel because in the next episode, we're going to go deeper into those four inner streams of thought that Scripture reveals are always happening within the human mind. And if you want to go beyond these public teachings in a more guided and structured learning environment, I also have a community called How to Hear the Voice of God on the School platform, where we practice these things together. So if you're interested in that, you'll find that link in the description below. So stay encouraged because God is closer than you think. I'll see you in the next episode.